And I remind you that the purpose of our trip there really was to seek to encourage our brothers and sisters in Christ in Ethiopia. And we were doing that by going and showing our presence, that we have concerns and prayers for them, meeting the teachers, the preachers, the evangelists, the administrators, and all of their mission efforts there. So our focus this morning is to look to see how we're going to seek to serve and glorify our Father in heaven by reaching out to the people of Ethiopia and helping them spread the good news of Jesus Christ. Sam is first going to give you kind of an overview of our mission support, what's taking place there and what we at Hendersonville do to support it. Then I'm going to come back and give you some highlights of the trip to help you better understand the people and the country and what we're doing there. And right after that, we're going to show a short video that Ben Godley's put together for us, and I hope that recaps and really touches your heart about this mission effort. Sam?
Okay, thank you, Bill. I don't think I'm good on my mic. Oh, thank you. Our work at Hendersonville in Ethiopia began about 2000, 2001 when Don Yelton and Jerry Sin made a trip there. And while there, they met an American missionary from California named John Ed Clark. John Ed Clark had been working with the Ethiopian people and the Ethiopian government for about 40 years. I think he started in the late 60s, early 70s. And Don Yelton told me this morning that his first trip to Ethiopia was 55 years ago. Is that correct? So there's been a presence there for several years, to say the least. But John Ed mentioned and challenged Don and Jerry in the early 2000s for Hendersonville to become a major supporter in the western area of Ethiopia, specifically the town of Nekemp. Now, Nekemp is located halfway between the center of Ethiopia and the Sudan border. And at that time, it was largely an untouched, unevangelized area. And it still very much is today. Most of the congregations there are 10 years old or less. There may have been one or two small congregations prior to Nekemp being established, but Hendersonville was a major player. We started supporting that work in Nekemp. And Ethiopia is kind of an unusual structure in that there is the Church of Christ Mission located in Addis, and that is an NGO, a non-government organization. And they oversee the works like the deaf school, the kindergartens, the water drilling projects. Then there's the other aspect of it, that is the preacher training and the churches and the evangelistic outreach. And we're able to do that. The government allows the Church of Christ to do that because we do the humanitarian work. We do work with the deaf students, we work with the kindergartens, and they look very favorably upon that and allow us to exist there without persecution and very much work hand in hand with us. But let me introduce you to two or three of the individuals that live in Ethiopia and work very hard there to help us. Do we have the slides? Okay, this is a photograph of Bill and myself on your left, and on the right are two Ethiopians. The one to the far right is Alamayu. Alamayu at one time was a refugee that fled to Kenya and met Bahalu there and was baptized. Alamayu lives in Addis, and his primary responsibility is bookkeeping and coordinating with the government on the humanitarian projects and those kind of overall organizational tasks that need to be done. Standing next to him, between me and Alamayu, is a man named Mogus. Now, Mogus traveled with Bill and I quite a bit on this trip. Mogus is a former police officer in Ethiopia, and he's got some stories to tell, believe me, as you ride around some of the things that happened to him during his training and while he was a police officer. But John Ed and several people have said that Mogus is a modern-day Paul, speaking about his personality and his courage, because he's a very bold speaker, and he will go into those areas that may not necessarily be safe, and he'll preach and teach about Christ, and he's just a very bold, energetic individual. Okay, next slide. This man's name is Lima. Now, you've probably heard me discuss in the past or talk about a man named Donachu. Donachu was the director of the compound or the campus in the camp. He was over all of it, the preacher training, the deaf schools, the kindergarten. Most of you know Donachu passed away about 2 years ago after he suffered a stroke. Lima had been working closely with him, so he rose up and assumed those responsibilities, and I'm happy to say, and that was kind of one of my concerns when we traveled in the camp, I'm happy to say that it's in very good hands, and Lima is doing a very good job in overseeing that. This next slide is of a lady named Abby. And Abby is Donachu's widow. And she assumed the responsibilities, I guess, probably the level of like a school principal over the deaf school and the kindergarten. We specifically, Hendersonville's monies go to the kindergarten. That's what they're assigned for. And that was the first building or the first work that happened that was organized in the camp. And from that has grown the entire compound. But Abby's overseeing that work, and she is Donachu's widow. Now you ask yourself, why do we support this work in Ethiopia? Let me just tell you two stories that I saw while there. Next slide. This is Mogus on the left, Lima on the right. And keep in mind, Lima is the preacher over the director of compound at the camp. Lima went out about 2 weeks prior to our arrival to a town located about 75 or 100 miles from the camp and did what we call street preaching. That's very popular there. Crowds will gather if you will preach. Lima was preaching, and this man in the center overheard him, stood and listened along with the group that was with him. You see, he's the leader of a group that gathers together and studies the Bible. And it never was really clear to me if there's a congregation or if that's just a group of individuals that were gathering together to study the Bible. I never was really sure about that. But anyway, as we were standing in the compound one day, he walks in, he's got a suitcase. I didn't know who he was. And he comes walking up and he addresses Mogus and Lima and he says, I heard you speaking in my hometown. Unscheduled, he took a bus and walked the 75 to 100 miles, walked into the compound and said, I want to study with you. What you're saying about the Bible seems to be true. Seems to make sense. I'd like to study that. And if, after studying with you, it appears to be true, me and my whole group will follow the teachings of the Church of Christ. Mogus didn't have the time to study with him then, but he scheduled a time. He said, if you will get to Addis, we will provide you food and lodging for 2 weeks, and we'll study for the 2 weeks that you're there. I don't know where that went, but in all probability, there will be 60 to 70 people, individuals, that will become members of the Church of Christ because of that one man. And that happened while Bill and I were standing on the compound. This next slide is of the compound or the campus in Jima. I had never been to Jima. I've been to Ethiopia 5 times, but I had never been to Jima before. It's known for its coffee. If you look on Facebook, I'm roasting coffee yesterday in my backyard. We brought back some green coffee beans. But Jima is a large city, and it was founded on the coffee business. It is 40% Muslim. There is a mosque located right outside the compound that we have. All that is located on this compound are the church, the building where the church meets, and a kindergarten. Many of the children that come to the kindergarten are children of Muslims. they go back and sing the songs and tell the stories that they've heard about in the kindergarten. And we can imagine what God will do with that in the years to come. I said I was just going to tell you 2 stories, but I have to tell this third one because it probably touched my heart more than any other story while I was there. Bill and I spoke there. That was the last congregation that we spoke at. And I was preaching, standing at the podium, and I looked back. Bill was seated on the left-hand side. And I was talking about the burden that was on Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and how it was just like a weight on his shoulders. And I was trying to get people to think back in their lives when they've had a time of discouragement and just a burden on them. And I looked and I noticed there was a man with his hand behind Bill, with his face buried in both hands, and he was sobbing. I thought, boy, it's unusual that you see something like that. Finished the lesson, went outside, and one of the members of the staff came up to me and said that at one time that man had been a leper. And when this compound was started, people asked, why are you going to put it there? It's near a death town. And that's where the lepers and the AIDS patients gather, and they live in that area where we located this compound. So that's who we're reaching, the Muslim and those that are hurting and carrying this tremendous, tremendous burden in life. So that's why I go. That's probably one of the stories that touched my heart more than anything. Bill's going to tell us a little bit about the trip, and I'm interested to hear his perspective since this was his first time.
Thank you, Sam. I went to Ethiopia because I've never been to the continent of Africa. And I'd heard Don and Sam and others speak so much about it and the receptiveness of the people to the Word of God. So it was a little intriguing, but I'd have to admit, I really always pictured Ethiopia as desert and very arid, because a lot of the pictures you see on television and so forth present such. And I'm going to step down so I don't interfere with you watching these slides, but I'll keep talking. So if you bring up the first slide, you'll see as we were going around the area, we did see some desert area and camels, so forth. But we were traveling principally to the south central area and to the western part of Ethiopia. And so there's not a lot of hard desert. That's more in the southeast and northeast. Next slide. So the next few slides are going to show you just a little bit about the terrain. Next. Beautiful. I was totally amazed at the variance in the terrain. It's very much like the United States. Next slide. In that we have a lot of different terrain. And here we were up in the rolling hills on the edge of the mountains, looking out over the valleys. Again, beautiful. Next slide. As we got more into the mountainous area, and the terrain turned to rich and lush. A lot of really rich farmlands, and that totally caught me off guard. I just had not thought about that. Next slide. Just some farmlands, raising of different grains and so forth. Next slide. This is interesting. This is a grain that they commonly use for bread. It's found most all over the country. And in the background of what they call
false banana.
False bananas. And they're just non-bearing, but they use the roots much as a powder, as much as flour and that type of thing to make breads. Next slide. So the next thing we're going to look at quickly is some of the cities and down to villages. Next slide. In Addis, it's really quite modern in the sense that they have the structures and everything. And I'd have to say it is a third world country. And their ability and resources to maintain some really nice things goes down quickly. So even though it was built to very good standards, it erodes quickly because they don't maintain it well. You see wide streets in some of the cities. Next slide. See the goats on the side. This was in a hotel in a nice city where we were staying. Looking out the back windows, you see, much like in the United States, if you go look out the back window of something, you'll see a lesser neighborhood, perhaps. So they distinctly have the good and the bad. These are blue ants, little taxis that are all over the cities there. Next slide. And again, looking out the back window of a hotel, you see a bus depot. This is right out Sam's window. And it's very crowded, very congested, perhaps not too well organized. Next slide. But there are modern conveniences. You can walk right out the hotel, you know, and Sam gets his shoe shines. Next slide. While we were in some of the big cities, we did get to eat in some of the restaurants, and the people there were very cautious. Our traveling mates were very cautious to make sure we only ate in the right restaurants so we wouldn't get sick. But this is a sample platter, enough to feed 4 people. Next slide. Typical spread, a really nice spread that might be found in a home. Next slide. The treasured resource, coffee. And my traveling mates love coffee, so I was in good standing. Next slide. Going down to some of the smaller towns, had a lot of side markets on the streets. Next slide. Next slide. And this is very common in any third world country. Here you see the wide streets and you see the drainage ditches that are on the sides there. And again, the markets. Next. These, the high school had just turned out, and of course, all the students in the uniforms and everything. Very crowded, busy little place. Next. In some of the more remote towns, the construction is much poorer, if you will, and there are people either drying grains and so forth out on the tarps on the street because it's nice and flat. And they're also selling. Next. This is down at the really remote village kind of level with thatch huts, and we'll talk about more of that in just a moment. Next slide. Looking at the roads, we traveled in a 4-wheel vehicle about 1,200 kilometers or 744 miles. And our bodies suffered the impact because of the roads that we were going over. We were constantly moving. They have some nice paved roads, and as you get out further into the areas, you get on dirt roads and gravel roads next, and you can also see the construction of homes and everything. Everything uses the roads. Even if it's paved, everybody uses it. They walk or they ride. The animals, you got donkeys, goats, cattle, some horses, and if you're driving, you yield to them, and sometimes that gets rather challenging. Poor little burros were everywhere, and they get worked really hard. Next slide. Baboons cross the highway in front of us. Next slide. See, we got several chances to see those. Next slide. Again, just showing you the dirt out in the rural areas. It's kind of a dirt gravel road. You can see the vegetation on the right where they're planting crops. But even in the remote areas, there were a lot of vehicles. Next. Again, more dirt. Showing you the dust. Showing you people walking on the road. People riding these little carts with the burros. Next slide. Construction on the roads was everywhere. And it's interesting to note that the Chinese have really moved into the country and are taking on major infrastructure projects, anything from major buildings to road construction all over the country. And of course they're doing this to get inroads, not a play on words, but to use inroads into the country to get at their natural resources. And that's one thing that we saw, that while it's rich farmland and they have a lot of natural resources there, the people are still poor because they can't get it from point A to point B, or they don't have the magnitude of industrialization there to manufacture. Next slide. Going into houses, these are the Tugel.
Yeah.
Tugel. These are the little huts that are the basis of houses around the country, whether you're out toward the desert area or back up in the lush areas. And next slide. These houses are made on the base, the walls, by interlacing or weaving saplings in a woven pattern around, and then they mud over them with straw and mud. So it's kind of like adobe as far as the concept's concerned. And then mostly thatch roofs. As you get into, next slide, as you get into some of the towns, you'll see that there are square buildings or rectangular buildings with rooms, and usually with a tin roof, but they still have the mud adobe kind of walls to them. Next slide. You see the lush vegetation back there. Now, next slide, getting into some of the faces about the people, and I love taking pictures of the people and of children. Next slide. If you'll notice the clothing that they're wearing a lot of times, but most of them have smiles on their faces. Next. In the kindergartens, the children, or in the schools, the children wear uniforms there. Next slide. This little girl is deaf, she's signing. Next slide. This represents a poor population there. Next slide. Next. I caught this picture of kids playing in the creek. And the water's dirty because they was near the well drilling operation. Next slide. Just the face of a lady on the road. Next slide. You see what kind of water they have to deal with in a lot of the places. That leads us to the well drilling projects in a minute. Here, they're threshing the grain. They have the cattle that they drive around and around and around. And what they're doing is separating the grain head from the stalk of the grain. And next slide, you'll see they're throwing the grain up in the air to get the chaff out of the grain so that they can grind it. Next slide. Next. I threw this picture in because this lady was so proud of her little kitchen. This was a kitchen at one of the preacher training schools. And so we went in to look at it, and she was showing us all about it. And she was just really happy and proud of what she was doing. Next slide. This is a deaf minister in one of the chapels. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. Next slide. Now I want to move to talk a little bit about compounds. You hear that word used, and what does it really mean? Well, the compounds in most third world countries is simply that you have a fence or a wall around your house, but it may be more than that. It may be around a series of buildings or a series of homes, and you drive your vehicles in there and keep them secure. You may have animals inside, keeping them secure as well. But the compound is just a fence around your property, if you will. And this is at Addis. They're in the capital, the mission compound. And this is the administrative office there. And then the next slide, you'll see here Alamayu, what I'll call as the director of the mission effort there. Next slide. Next. This was right after we arrived there in Addis. I think it was Monday morning after we got there Sunday night. And we were sitting around planning what we were going to do for the next week to make sure we were coordinated. And the gentleman on the right, his name is Habtu, and he is a native Ethiopian, and he is currently in Washington, D.C., and he attends the Falls Church of Christ there. And a couple of times a year, he will go back over to Ethiopia with outreach and taking care of relatives that he has there and friends and so forth. So he knows the area well. He traveled with us the first week. The second person from the left, kind of at the back toward the window, is Bill Morrow, and he's an elder at a Church of Christ in California, and he also traveled with us. He goes over to Ethiopia about twice a year doing various works, but he's specifically interested in developing computer labs there, and he has one started now at Awassa, and he's starting another one there in Addis. And then there's Sam, what's the gentleman in the blue shirt? Demerol. And Mogus on the left, who traveled with us the second week out west. Next slide. Hop to Sam, Bill Morrow, as we were planning. And it was interesting traveling with them because they had done things we hadn't done. Of course, I hadn't done anything. I was learning from all three of these guys, and it was really interesting what they showed us and how to do things and what not to do and so forth. Next slide. This is the compound in Addis. You can see the gates over to the left, the entrance, and it does have a wall around it with the vehicles in it and the schools. Next. In each compound of the mission effort, and I'll say there are 7 key locations around Ethiopia that this mission effort reaches out to. Each one of them will have a deaf school, because that's our entry point, and they have a kindergarten and sometimes up to middle school, and they will have a chapel there, and they will have a preacher training school. All of them, sometimes the chapel or the preaching training school might be outside the compound. Most of the time it's inside. So this is the schoolyard there, and the buildings around are for the deaf school and kindergarten. Next. Every morning the kids start with an assembly outside and basically Pledge of Allegiance. Next. Just a quick picture of the kindergarten. They all wear uniforms, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Next. Some of the buildings, this is a preacher training school, part of that same compound. Next. Just students in a typical preacher training school. There'll be 10 to 15 students and maybe up to 5 instructors that are there. Next. This is one of those at a different location. Next. A chapel is usually in each of the compounds, and sometimes there is a regular congregation there, but every morning the school kids go in at 9 o'clock for chapel. Next. Just some big pictures of another compound. That's a chapel on the right there. On the left are school classrooms. Next. The computer lab, a growing outreach ministry there. And as I said, Bill Morrow there on the left is heading this up with Bill. What's his name? James?
Oh, the Ethiopian?
Yes. Chamelis, right. Chamelis is really bright, educated, and could go get a high-tech job in a heartbeat and has been offered it, but he is staying there with a mission effort because he sees this is something that really will help God's word spread there. Interesting point about the computer labs is that when we got government approval to do this, the government said, oh, can we send some of our employees over? So we have government employees coming over to sit through the school, which was really designed for the students and their families. But it is a good outreach because they teach in English, which is why the government wants to do it. They teach software applications and systems, and they use the Bible as the example text and when they're doing things. Next. Another major effort here is the well drilling. This has been going on in Ethiopia for some time. Healing Hands is a key sponsor here. They have the contract with the government, and They move around the country and would drill, say, a contract in this province to drill 17 wells, and then to go to the next one. But you can see on the truck it's Church of Christ. Next. 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 Kids are always around. When they're drilling, the kids come around, adults come around. And that's an excellent opportunity to intermingle, get to know the leadership of the area. And so the evangelist from the mission effort will then go into that area during the drilling and after the drilling in order to take advantage of that contact with the people and spread God's word. Finished product here is a well for the community. Good, clean water. Next. This is Kirk Myers. Kirk Myers has headed this well drilling effort up around the world for probably 30 years. And his wife, next slide. Mary is a nurse and is a teacher, and whenever she goes out to the sites a lot of times and is actually teaching the kids or teaching the ladies of the village different skills. Next. This is their house. This is a shipping container that on the inside looks like an RV. They have really fixed it up. And when they move, get ready to go to the next well site, back a truck under it, lower the jacks, go to the next site, put the jacks up, house on stilts, so to speak. And Mary is very funny talking about it. Next. Another Kirk and Sam. Next. Again, finished product. Sam was trying to take some pictures of this, linking our ability to reach out to the community, drill these wells, providing pure water for them, but also providing the water of life for baptism back there. Next. We distributed some clothes while we were there. Some ladies at the Biltmore congregation made the little pillowcase dresses. And we took roughly 60-something, I guess, over there with us and distributed those. And also Hop2 brought a lot from the D.C. area of other clothes. Next. So you can see we were in a very remote little village of thatch huts. And their poverty was evident. Next. Next. So Hop2 trying to fit some of the clothes on the little kids. Next, they were very proud and very protective of their new clothes, not to share them. Next, I want to talk a little bit about Nekemte, which is our major focus of support. You can see, again, the compound, in this case it's fenced with a wire fence, but it has a guest house, it has a preacher training school, it has a kindergarten and the deaf school all there. Next, the chapel and the classrooms on each side. Next, the guest house, and that's the kind of vehicle that we travel in all the time. Next, their assembly there for the morning. Next, they use the chapel for assembly and they go in. And the kids are really disciplined. It was very nice to see. And you would see a little kid. You would see a little kid there leading singing, and he's going like this, and he's walking back and forth in front of the kids singing. They were really training them well, really. And the kids would. They would call on the kids to pray. They would call on them to lead singing. Here, they're gathering for morning tea, and they literally serve them tea and bread. Next slide. And this sometimes is the only meal that some of the kids get that are local. In the kindergarten, again, they wear uniforms, and they're teaching in sign language and orally as well. Next. Here's Mogus talking to this little kid in sign language. Next. So they may bring a child up, and there could be 5 children, or it could be 35 children in there. And the teacher, again, all the teachers are certified as sign language as instructors. Next. Next. During all assemblies and everything, everybody learns sign language. Next. Something particular for the deaf children, most of them come from far away. They're not right there in the little town. So they have to be boarded. And so not only do they provide the education for them, but they also provide some skills in sustaining themselves, if you will. And they get very proficient at this. Next. And some ladies from the local town come in sometimes and sit in on the classes and learn to do it as well. Next. There at Nekempt also, again, is a preacher training school. Next. And they provide boarding, if you will, for the people that come in for the preacher's training school. And they're there usually for 4 months for the first course, first round, if you will, step 1. And then step 2 is another basically 4 months. And there is a step 3 that they do occasionally. The key thing that Sam and I were doing over there, again, was encouraging, teaching, and preaching. And so we went around to several different congregations there, preaching and teaching on Sundays and Wednesdays. Next. This was done in a little house that housed 2 families as well as being the site for the church. So it's truly a house church. Preaching. Next. 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 Next slide. So you can see that we were active, we were busy. I've got kind of a summary I want to share with you. While we were there, as I said, we traveled roughly 744 miles. We visited 10 different of the mission locations over the 15 days that we were on the ground. We visited 7 kindergartens and deaf schools, and we taught in 3 different locations in the preacher training schools, and we taught in 3 different congregations. A lot of the schools and the preacher training schools were on break, so we didn't get to all 7 necessarily. And we want to wrap up this presentation this morning with a short video that Being Godly put together for us. And again, our desire is that this video will help endear the people of Ethiopia to your hearts as we seek to preach and teach the good news of Christ. Video.
ያሰኛል እርካታን ይሰጣል አንድ ጊዜም ኑሮ ከጌታ ከኢየሱስ ጋር በሸለቆ ቢሆን በተራራ አመቺ ነው ደስ ያሰኛል እርካታን ይሰጣል ትልቁ ጌታዬ ትልቁ አባቴ
My name is Mogas Walde. I just came from Addis Ababa. Now we found in Nakamte kindergarten and deaf school and Nakamte Church of Christ. Just behind me there are many deaf children who are really orphans. They came here to study, to get their training as deaf students, and the same time they got a training, a basket making business, and they raise some kind of income for them and for their family too. They have taken care of themselves, and we really are very happy that we are able to help those needy children. Thank you, our American brothers and sisters who really have interest, and really I thank you very much, especially this time that Brother Sam and Brother Bill are with us. We love them very much. We really thank you for supporting them to send to Ethiopia, to visit us, to encourage us, to share their love and their experience with us. It means a lot for us, not only for us, but also for these deaf, destitute children. Thank you for the love. Thank you very much.
I go to Ethiopia because obviously I have a heart for it and I love the people. But I love you too. All the elders love this congregation. If there's anybody here that needs prayer, if there's anybody here that needs to put on baptism, come forward as we sing. And if anyone responds, let me ask the other elders to come forward and respond with them if we have any response.
What a friend we have in Jesus. All sins and griefs to bear. What privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. My God,